The North Gauteng High Court today heard an application to overturn the signing of the NHI. The application has been brought by the Board of Healthcare Founders and the South African. We understand that this is the South African Private Practitioners Forum. Joining us for more on this is SABC News reporter Gauteng. Good afternoon, Gauteng. Thank you very much, as always, for joining us. Talk us through court proceedings today, and perhaps starting with just what is at the heart of this application that has been brought by these two organizations.
A very good afternoon to you, Mfundo, and to our viewers and listeners at home. Well, today we spent most of the day really at the North Gauteng High Court there in Pretoria. This is because there's a legal challenge that has been mounted here against government, or the president being the first respondent here, and the Minister of Health being the second respondent. So we have those that are within the medical health scheme and the practitioners just moving into the courts to challenge the signing into law of this particular act. So we saw President Cyril Ramaphosa in May last year just signing this bill into an act, really just making way for the implementation of the National Health Insurance. So it's all about universal access to health. And we hear those that are within the private sector and the private medical aid space really just saying that in its current nature, that document needs to be set aside, needs to be reviewed, and they're challenging the constitutionality of it just coming into being. So we see them today just approaching the judge here, Judge Twala, asking for him to really more or less give them an ear in terms of their concerns here. They're saying that these are concerns that are not new. They've been raised with the president before. They've fallen on deaf ears, and the president went on the eve of the elections, that's what they said, to sign this a bill into an act. And we see them...
Pardon me for interjecting there. Yeah. So are there concerns around the NHI in its entirety? Are they opposed to universal coverage in this respect? Because it's a sensitive issue. Many of them have tried to almost stress that it is not universal coverage that they're opposed to, but the act in its current form. So what is their opposition here?
Their opposition are basically about the nitty-gritties, the rollout. For instance, they've taken issue with Section 17 of this particular act, saying that if that is to go ahead, then we'll see basically the NHI eating into the basically the fold of the medical aid of the practitioners in this particular instance. So they want clarity around some procedures as well that will fall under the NHI, that will not in any way be encroaching into the work of the medical aids. And also at the same time, they want clarity around the funding of this particular act and its rollout, to say if you are going to start this major project of this particular nature, we need to understand the finer details in terms of where we find ourselves, but also saying that when you look at it, they are casting doubt on the fact that there could have been a process here that led us to the president signing this into law in terms of an issue that they've raised around the records. They want the records to be made public here in terms of what informed the president signing it into law in its current nature, saying that we can't allow for this process to be rolled out and start the initial phase of this with some of those issues that are hanging. So they want the court to shed clarity on how we move here. But at the same time, we saw the issue of jurisdiction coming into play. Because we see the court, for instance, yesterday we saw the minister's lawyers and the president's lawyers arguing to say, if yours is to say that we are challenging the constitutionality of this particular act, why not then approach the constitutional court basically to challenge and to argue your case there? So the matter started with basically issues around jurisdiction, but we see, for instance, today, Advocate du Plessis just arguing to say that this particular court, the High Court, is the right one, especially when you look at the issue that there's secrecy around what informed this decision. So we want the court to also ensure that these records are released to the public, so we get to understand why the president then moved in that particular manner and why then we find ourselves here. So it's a case that we saw today being disrupted by power cuts. It moved from physical to virtual. At the same time, outside there was COSATU and other members of the public that were demonstrating in support of the president and the health minister.
When you touch on the aspect of them wanting to know more details around the funding model, but also wanting more details around procedures that will be covered still by medical aids, if medical aids are still to exist beyond the NHI, They want that distinction. But I remember quite vividly, this was the distinction that journalists themselves even wanted. There were many organizations that said, let's talk about the funding model, but we were told, at least by government, that in this first phase, they're going to then deal with how or this specific NHI will be funded. So all of those details were still to come. They were still being conceptualized. So it's going to be quite interesting to find out if those type of documents at this point exist when we understood it, that they were still going to almost conceptualize how this NHI will be funded. Are we all going to perhaps put our money into a national health insurance fund, or how it will be funded? But beyond that, even the procedures that will be excluded from the NHI was something that was still to be discussed. But as for COSATU and everybody that was outside, when engaging them, do they, to a certain extent, not understand some of the issues around the vagueness, or they're quite comfortable to say, let's move to the second phase, even if there are certain elements that right now have not been addressed?
Well, they're saying here that really when you look at it, it's as if the medical practitioners, the medical aides, for instance, the organizations would want to maintain the status quo. Theirs is to say that it can't be business as usual when there are these inequalities, stark inequalities between the private healthcare and the public healthcare. Today, I was with COSATU outside the High Court, and they were giving us a sense of how even when you walk into the facilities of the private spaces, you are treated like a king. You know what I mean? The space is just so favorable compared to what happens in the public health sector. And they're saying that really, when you look at it, there have been also subsidies that are going into the private sector. So they're getting the most, whilst the public sector is not getting the most. So they want the NHI to be rolled out as a matter of urgency for it to stabilize and level the playing field. They're saying actually that when you look at it, it's as if these organizations are jumping the gun because we haven't even gotten to get a sense of the board that will need to be instituted here. There's a need for a CEO that will need to be appointed here. There's a need to ensure that at least also we get a sense of how then government is going to be rallying the monies that will go into this particular fund. So it's a fund that will be initiated here that will see everything else flowing from that fund. So they're saying that as much as we say, please, let's roll it out, we understand that it's going to be introduced in phases. So we should let the process to take its course. But they're saying that the reason why we find ourselves here is because those that are within the private health space would want to maintain the status quo and not want to come up here. But also, when you look at it, you hear them also arguing, those that are within the private space, to say the reason why then there haven't been adequate, care in terms of the maintenance of some of these infrastructures. It will be that there's lack of the delivery of services from officials that were supposed to be doing that, but at the same time there've been corruption that has been rife cited in this space, and most of those that are within the private healthcare space is to say that really then we can't allow then even the private space to find itself deteriorating at the same rate and space that we've seen the public sector deteriorating. But when you look at it, COSATU maintaining here, but when you look at some of the issues that have been raised, they've been rallied and banded here, is the issue of ensuring at least that there is adequate universal health care and access to these facilities for all that live here in South Africa.
Katlego, it remains a very interesting case, but the private sector had committed or threatened that they would fight the NHI to the bitter end. But thank you very much for that reportage. That's SABC News reporter Katlego Legodi, who was monitoring proceedings in court today in relation to the NHI for us.